Hey guys, tonight we're sliding into the cushions of ancient Rome, not just to nap, but to feast. Imagine this, the flicker of oil lamps dancing across marble walls, the scent of roasted dormice and honeyed dates hanging in the air. You step into the atrium, draped in linen that's entirely too scratchy, and make your way toward a dining room that isn't full of chairs, but couches. And not just any couches, these are status symbols, social contracts, and yes, potential trap. You're not sitting. No, that would be far too sensible. You're reclining, left elbow dug into a padded bolster, feet stretched toward the next guy's face, trying not to dribble wine down your tunic. Why? Because in Rome, lying down to eat means you've made it. It tells everyone in the room that you're free, male, and powerful enough to chew horizontal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time you're watching. I always love seeing where in the world you're nodding off. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You ease into the triclinium, the Roman dining room, and immediately realize this isn't a casual meal. This is a battlefield disguised in cushions and roasted boar. The rules here are so specific, they make modern restaurant etiquette look like a food fight in a preschool. First off, you can't just flop anywhere. The couches, called clini, are arranged in a U-shape, and each one has a hierarchy. The leftmost couch, the lectus immus, is for lesser guests. The middle couch, lectus medius, is the sweet spot, but only its center position. The locus medius is the real place of honor. You don't sit there unless you've got something serious going for you. And finally, the couch on the right, lectus summus, is technically the highest ranking, but only the guy on the far end gets the full glory. Confused? Don't worry. So were half the senators. If you're placed wrongly, say on the lowest couch when you're supposed to be next to the consul, it's a public snub. You're not just eating figs, you're digesting humiliation. Historians still argue whether this seating system was rigid or allowed subtle maneuvering, depending on politics, but one thing's clear. Dining position was social chess, and everyone around that table was playing. The reclining itself? Well, let's just say your chiropractor wouldn't approve. You lay on your left side, propped on your elbow, and use your right hand to grab morsels from a communal platter. No individual plates, because personal boundaries hadn't been invented yet. You're chewing alongside the senator of grain supply, the guy who arrested your cousin last week, and someone's awkward brother-in-law. Reclining here isn't just about being comfortable. It's about signaling that you're Roman enough to multitask, eat, debate, boast, and maybe scheme, all without ever fully sitting up. There's a deep irony in all this. The Romans prided themselves on gravitas, dignity, seriousness, moral fiber, and yet here they are, half lying on furniture like tipsy uncles at a barbecue, debating fiscal reform while eating fish sauce with their fingers. It's a visual contradiction so rich it belongs in a sitcom. But there's more. According to some fringe sources, like late Roman satirists, certain politicians became obsessed with the recline right aesthetic. They'd have personal slaves pose their elbows, adjust their tunics, even angle their heads just so to project maximum nonchalance. There were whisperings of dining tutors. Yes, people who coached you on how to look relaxed while eating grapes. If that's not a masterclass in insecurity, I don't know what is. And then there's the paranoia. Reclining meant you had to trust everyone else around you. You're in a vulnerable position, literally. Your back's exposed. your legs are tangled with someone else's. And if the guy behind you happens to be nursing a grudge over last week's Senate vote, well, let's just say dining in Rome wasn't always a digestive process. The risk was real enough that some high Seppa Romans opted out entirely. They dined at home, upright, alone, ostensibly for health or stoic simplicity, but probably because the politics of posture were just too exhausting. Of course, that had consequences too. Declining an invitation, or worse, refusing to recline, could be interpreted as arrogance, protest, or secret illness. Remember, in a society obsessed with public image, even how you ate could unravel your career. One final bite before we move on. Contrary to Hollywood's pillow-heavy orgy scenes, most Roman couches were firm, utilitarian slabs with thin padding and occasionally no backrests. If you're picturing a lush daybed, adjust expectations. These were more like glorified gym mats. And yet, they cradled the fate of empires. Now that you're awkwardly elbow-deep in your first Roman dinner party, you begin to realize this isn't just about whether the honeyed dormice are overcooked. It's about where you're lying. The couch layout, the triclinium, is a seating chart carved from centuries of power games, and every cushion tells a story. You're not just reclining, you're being ranked. The host doesn't plop guests down at random. No, each placement is a calculated signal, like passive-aggressive place cards from hell. If you're lucky enough to be on the lectus medius, the center couch, you feel the pull of pride, especially if you're in the middle seat, the locus medius, also called the consul's place, the most prestigious spot at the whole event. That's where the real gossip, debates, and political flirting happen. But be warned, that coveted seat also comes with exposure. Everyone sees you. Everyone judges your table manners. You drop one olive and it's tomorrow's Senate rumor. That's the price of prominence in a world where posture equals prestige. Now let's pan to the lectus summus, the highest couch on the right-hand side. It sounds elite, but don't be fooled. The middle seat here is a little awkward, half honor, half exile. You're high-ranking, but not the life of the party. You might be a former consul or a respected elder, a big name but no longer the name. And the far-left couch, the lectus imus, is where the lesser folks land. Visiting poets, merchants, or some poor guy who once insulted the host's mulled wine. This isn't just dinner. It's an act of spatial diplomacy. Historians still argue whether this system reflected a rigid caste or had flexibility based on mood and favors. The safest answer? Probably both. A host with guts might promote a lower Seppa friend to a higher couch, sending a signal, and a host with enemies might pretend a mix-up, humiliating a rival with plausible deniability. Oh, did we put Lucius on the far couch? Must have been an oversight. So sorry. The real genius of the layout? No one sits alone. Each couch fits 3 guests, and each person has a title. The summus, medius, and imus, top, middle, and bottom. And they lie in sequence, elbow to elbow, with heads staggered diagonally. You're practically breathing on your neighbor's collarbone. Good thing Romans bathed. Sometimes. But what if the host wanted to stir the pot? Then they'd sit political enemies side by side. Imagine reclining next to the man who blocked your grain subsidy last week, your forearms brushing every time you reach for garum sauce. Suddenly, that eel pie is harder to swallow. The idea wasn't just to eat together. It was to test your civility. Can you share fish paste with a man you fantasize about exiling? Rome hoped so. There's a darker layer, too. The seating order mirrored the pecking order of empire. The higher your spot, the closer you reclined to the host. Literally, symbolically, and politically. Rome was obsessed with proximity to power, and nothing displayed that more clearly than a couch arrangement. A senator 3 cushions away from the consul knew his days of influence might be numbered. The Whisper Network would notice. Want a fringe fact? Some Roman hosts reportedly rotated guests between couches mid-banquet like a political game of musical chairs. Each course could come with a new position, forcing alliances to shift and small talk to reboot. Did this happen at every dinner? No. But when it did, it was theater, and everyone knew it. There's also evidence that certain wild card guests, jesters, entertainers, even philosophers, were placed strategically to either cool tensions or provoke them. Picture a stoic moralist sandwiched between 2 wine-drunk tax officials arguing about temple reforms. You can almost hear his sigh. Of course, all of this relies on the assumption that you were invited in the first place. If you weren't even on the couches, if you stood, served, or simply watched, you were either a slave, a woman of high virtue, or someone not worth placing. We'll get to that gendered weirdness soon, but for now, just know this. Lying down in Rome meant rising up in reputation. Everyone was watching, and every position spoke volume. By the end of the evening, as incense coils around the last course and harpists start playing something vaguely tragic, you've learned something valuable. A Roman banquet wasn't about the food, it was about optics. Whether you were leaning in, laying back, or mentally calculating how many cushions away you were from Caesar's nephew, you were always being ranked. And if you think today's workplace politics are exhausting, imagine trying to climb the corporate ladder while half hog liver and trying not to drop duck liver on your neighbor's sandals. You're 3 figs deep, half reclined on your elbow, and just beginning to master the fine art of not dropping honey glaze down your sleeve. When it happens, the door creaks, heads turn, sandals scuff the marble. A senator arrives late, toga flapping like an annoyed swan, and the whole couch hierarchy shifts like a domino setup teetering on scandal. Because when it comes to Roman dining, senators follow rules that make airport security look laid back. These aren't just mealtime preferences. They're codified customs, expectations wrapped in law, reputation, and years of power games. And nowhere is this more ridiculous or revealing than how senators must behave at dinner. First rule? Senators eat last. Yes, really, unless the gathering is strictly political or the host is also a senator. These men of Rome are often placed behind equestrians, merchants, even military tribunes in certain settings. Why? Because showing up at a private dinner party wasn't about pulling rank. It was about humility, or at least the pantomime of it. Roman elites lived in constant fear of looking too eager, too dominant, or too socially hungry. So you waited your turn. It was a kind of theatrical modesty, emphasis on theatrical. And once seated, reclined, you weren't free to just, enjoy yourself. Senators had an entire set of postural expectations that read like a yoga flow designed by a very judgy uncle. No sprawling, no slouching too deeply, no elbowing the guy next to you when the roasted peacock comes around. Most importantly, don't overshadow the host. Historians still argue whether these social restraints were born from actual legal codes or just hardened etiquette. But in Rome, the line between law and custom was as blurry as the bottom of a wine amphora. What we do know is that senators were expected to embody dignitas, a kind of public grace meets gravitas hybrid, and reclining too comfortably, that could be mistaken for arrogance, or worse, decadence, and decadence was dangerous. There are documented cases, plucked from scattered sources and ancient letters, of senators being scolded, even punished, for improper dining behavior. One poor soul reclined too early and was accused of attempting to usurp the tone of the evening. Another passed food too casually, as if he were serving pizza at a family reunion, and was met with sneering commentary about his Greek upbringing. That's right, passing a dish incorrectly could spark a xenophobic dig and social fallout. Oh, and then there's the issue of speaking. Senators at dinner must never dominate the conversation, unless, of course, they were the highest-ranking guest, in which case silence would be insulting. The balance was impossibly fine. You had to contribute just enough, not too little, not too much. Like the Goldilocks of politics, but reclining in a toga. Now picture this. You're a young senator, freshly elected, eager to prove yourself. You're invited to a prominent patron's banquet, a big deal. You arrive, cloak brushed, sandals polished, face rehearsed into neutral charm, and then you're seated far left, lowest couch, outermost edge, the guest fringe. It's a warning. You've either offended someone or you're being tested. The whole room knows. The trick now is to not show that you know, to recline with just enough confidence that your host reconsiders your status by the second course. Fun fact, some senators brought personal dining slaves, not just to serve food, but to subtly monitor who was seated where and relay that information later, like an ancient LinkedIn audit. Gaius was on the medius couch again. That makes 3 weeks in a row. These weren't servants. They were social analysts in tunics. One fringe historian even suggests that some ambitious politicians faked minor injuries, oh no, my elbow, to avoid reclining altogether, opting for a seated stool just outside the main ring. The message? I'm too humble for power games, or possibly, I'm scheming something bigger in the atrium. But perhaps the strangest senatorial rule of all? You couldn't outshine the decor. If the host's table had modest clay platters and rough-cut bread, you, no matter how many villas you owned, couldn't show up flaunting a gold drinking cup. Doing so was considered a form of insult, like saying, "Thanks for this lovely crust of barley. Here's what real wealth looks like." So senators often toned it down, dressing in simpler tunics for dinner than they would for court, just to stay on the safe side of the social blade. By dessert, usually something alarmingly sweet like dates stuffed with pine nuts and cheese, you've either survived the rules or slipped on one. Maybe you laughed too loud. Maybe you reached with your left hand. Maybe you forgot to wait for the host to sip first. Small things, but in the Roman world, small things could be fatal to reputations. So, as you lie there, belly full, mind buzzing from too much watered wine and even more posturing, you begin to understand. Being a Roman senator wasn't just about passing laws and waving scrolls. It was about knowing exactly how and when to lean. Because in this city, you rise not with a sword, but with your elbow. You've made it through the first course without offending the host, outshining the decor, or accidentally reclining like a freedman. But don't relax just yet. Your feet are in the spotlight now. Welcome to the baffling world of Roman dining posture, where ankles, sandals, and elbows could all carry political meaning. Let's begin with the feet. Roman tradition dictated that when you reclined to eat, you did so barefoot or in the softest, thinnest slippers, not in your formal sandals. Why? Partly because it showed cleanliness, more importantly because keeping your feet off the floor, tucked up politely on the couch, signaled that you understood your role, civilized, elite, and above the dust of everyday life. Literally, if your heel brushed the mosaic tiles, if your sandal clacked while adjusting your weight, you might as well have screamed new money into the atrium. True aristocrats floated through the feast. No noise, no stomp, just a slither of fabric and a curl of perfumed toes. And then there's the elbow. You learn fast that everything hinges, no pun intended, on your left elbow. Reclining on the left was standard, freeing your right hand to eat, gesture, or sip. Sounds easy, right? Until you try to keep your spine elegant, your tunic unwrinkled, your wine steady, and your table manners precise. All while leaning at a semi-horizontal angle with 3 other senators breathing in your ear. Now technically there's no official punishment for a crooked elbow or saggy shoulder, but the social consequences were real. The wrong angle could make you seem lazy, disrespectful, or overly casual. And if you dared to recline on your right side, you were making a statement, usually a defiant one, like some philosophers and fringe politicians liked to do when they wanted to show disdain for custom. Oh, you're on the left side like everyone else? How provincial. Historians still debate whether the strictness of this posture was uniformly enforced or if it softened depending on household or region. Some records imply elite homes had tutors for boys, teaching them how to recline properly from a young age. Others suggest that only particularly fastidious hosts made a fuss about it. But either way, you can bet your first grape that someone in the room is judging your posture. A particularly bizarre tidbit. There are mosaics that seem to show diners using tiny pillows, not for comfort, but to prop up their wrists, like some kind of ergonomic banquet support system. We're not talking plush Victorian fluff here. These were firm, decorative pads that kept the arm perfectly aligned while eating. It was like having a social exoskeleton. You weren't reclining. You were performing repose. And heaven help you if you crossed your legs. That, along with reclining too far back or chewing while flat, was often interpreted as feminine, or worse, Eastern. In a society obsessed with Roman masculinity and conservative body language, even how you bent your knee could summon a scandal. There's a record of one senator whose political rivals called him couch-born because he reclined too loosely, as if born for leisure instead of leadership. Out. Let's not forget the feet again. Yes, they're that important. While you might be lying down, your feet must point away from the host or other high-ranking guests. Point them towards someone and it could be seen as disrespect. Why? Because feet were gross. They carried the dirt of the street, the sweat of politics, and the stink of gladiator gossip. You didn't flaunt your soles at anyone you respected, and you certainly didn't rest them near a senator's fig tart. Want a weird fringe example? At one banquet recorded in a satirical letter, a particularly drunk guest stretched out so dramatically that his foot knocked over a platter, and it was considered an insult, not a clumsy accident. He was blacklisted from further dinners, not for the spill, for the posture. His foot had encroached on another man's political space. That's how serious this was. And then, of course, there were the slaves. Silent, skilled, almost invisible, tasked with adjusting your posture mid-meal. That's right. You didn't always do it yourself. If your cushion slipped, if your elbow lost its grace, a servant would slink in from behind and gently nudge you back into dignity. Imagine trying to have a conversation about aqueducts while someone is fluffing your lumbar support. Roman dining was not relaxing. It was dinner and discipline. There's even talk in ancient commentaries that posture could be weaponized. At politically charged feasts, guests would purposefully shift, just slightly, to isolate someone. If you were physically edged out of the curve of conversation, your recline angle could go from sociable to symbolic exile in minutes. One senator referred to this as being pushed to the marble, meaning he had no pillow behind him, no body touching his. Just cold space and political death. So, here you lie, elbow angle just right, feet discreetly tucked, eyes alert for even the smallest shift in body language. You're not just eating, you're surviving the Olympics of etiquette, and your posture is your uniform. Forget armor. Here your greatest protection is an elegant lean and a perfectly still sandal. You're finally getting the hang of it. Your elbow is steady, your feet are dignified, and your reclining angle could win medals. But then someone new enters the room. She's elegant, composed, dressed in layers of soft wool and silk, her hair wound in braids more complex than a Senate debate, and as she approaches the couches, she does not recline. Because if you're a Roman woman, at least one with a respectable reputation, you don't get a spot on the couch. Not next to your husband, not near the host, not even at the end with the olives. You stand, or maybe you sit on a simple chair off to the side. Welcome to the strange gender divide of Roman dining, where who got to recline wasn't just about class, it was about gender, morality, and control. The rule? No women on the left. Well, more precisely, no women reclining on the couches unless they were of questionable virtue or from foreign lands with looser customs. Respectable Roman matrons, the matronae, were expected to maintain their dignity by staying upright, literally. The image of a wife sprawled out among wine-soaked senators was too much for Rome's virtue-loving image-makers to tolerate. Historians still argue whether this was universally enforced or more a matter of elite conservative circles, but in general, Roman women who dined with men did so while seated, not reclining. That meant they were both included and excluded, present in the room but not part of the performance. And yes, that's exactly how Roman power structures liked it. There were exceptions, of course. Certain empresses, courtesans, or scandalously progressive women did recline, and oh, the scandal it caused. Think of it like this. If a man reclined improperly, he was mocked. If a woman reclined at all, she might find herself immortalized in some satirical poem or whispered about for decades. Reclining was loaded. Want an example? Clodia, the infamous sister of Publius Clodius Pulcher and a noted provocateur in her own right, was said to have reclined among men, and not just reclined, but done so with elegance, laughter, and entirely too much wit. The result? She was branded a seductress, a manipulator, a political poisoner. Whether she deserved that or not, her dining posture helped fuel the fire. Meanwhile, noble women who wanted to avoid even the whiff of scandal would often decline to attend such banquets at all. Or, if present, they'd occupy side rooms with other women or remain in the atrium, appearing only briefly to greet guests or hand out garlands. Dining, for them, was not a public ritual. It was a private necessity. But that doesn't mean women weren't watching. Oh no. They saw who sat where, who touched whose goblet, who lingered a little too long during the second course. Roman wives were political agents in their own right, even if their elbows weren't resting on cushions. They listened, they remembered, and they made sure their husbands did too. There's even fringe evidence that some elite households built dual dining spaces, one for the reclining political game, another more modest area where women and children dined upright. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of the adults' table and the kids' table, but with way more consequences. And here's a curious twist. In certain religious festivals or women-only events, women did recline. The custom flipped. In these rare settings, like the festival of Bonadea, men were banned, and women got to adopt the full luxury of the couch. For a single evening, the roles reversed. Power, posture, and wine all flowed in unexpected directions, a reminder perhaps that social customs were less about ability and more about control. Some Roman satirists even poked fun at male guests who were too stiff, too upright, suggesting they looked like matrone at dinner. It was a dig, of course, but it proves the point. Posture and gender were deeply linked. To recline was to command, to govern, to dominate the room, without ever standing. So here you are, reclining with aching grace, as the wives and daughters of your fellow diners circulate quietly behind you. They refill cups, they offer perfumed cloths, they speak softly to their husbands, and they do not lie down, not because they couldn't, but because society demanded they didn't. It's a strange scene, isn't it? A room full of men, half hidden in hall, puffed up with power, while the women, equal in mind, spirit, and often wit, sit or stand at the margins. This wasn't about comfort. It was about control over visibility. If you reclined, you were part of the spectacle. If you didn't, you were part of the structure propping it up. And yet, the whole system teetered on performance, because occasionally someone would break the rule. A wife would lean too far into the circle. A sister would crack a joke over the couch line. A courtesan would recline like a queen and draw every eye in the room. And when that happened, the whole dining order trembled. Just for a moment. By now, you've probably noticed something strange about Roman banquets. They're less about what's being eaten and more about who's watching you eat it. But there's another layer of strategy you haven't even unwrapped yet. The guest list. Because in ancient Rome, getting invited to a banquet wasn't just good fortune. It was a coded message, a political move, or sometimes an elaborate trap. You see, dinners weren't casual, they were appointments, performances, and opportunities to both flatter and destroy. Every name on that guest list had been weighed like fruit at the market. Too low session, you insult your peers by inviting them. Too high session, you risk being overshadowed. Too many clients and hangers-on, you look desperate. Not enough, you look cold. It's exhausting. And you haven't even ordered appetizers yet. So imagine the silent thrill or terror of receiving an invitation carved into wax on a folding tablet, delivered by a slave in livery. If you were a senator, this wasn't just a dinner. It was a public statement. You were worthy of being reclined near. Miss one without a good excuse and people started whispering. Attend too often and others accused you of bootlicking. Historians still debate whether these dinners were more social or strategic, but most agree the line between friendship and politics was as thin as a fig slice. Now here's where things get especially weird. Ghosting a dinner could ruin you. That's not an exaggeration. If you confirmed attendance and then failed to show, without illness, death, or divine omen, you might be deliberately excluded from future invitations. You didn't just snub the host, you questioned their social gravity. One orator wrote that failing to attend a banquet was like declining to salute the Republic with your mouth full. Harsh, but not inaccurate. Worse still was the fake excuse. Oh, I was detained at the forum, could be code for I had a better invitation. And if the host found out, you'd find yourself demoted to the lectus imus at your next appearance, or not invited at all. In some circles, banquets operated like social intelligence agencies. Guests would report on who was seen where, who cancelled on whom, and who reclined just a little too far toward the daughter of a Want a fringe case? A letter survives from a frustrated Roman noble who details, painfully, how he prepared an entire feast for 12, only for half the guests to cancel at the last moment. His solution? He made his slaves fill the empty spots and told them to behave like philosophers. We don't know if they pulled it off, but the bitterness is clear. In Rome, being stood up wasn't just annoying, it was reputational damage. That brings us to the idea of strategic invitations. Sometimes a host wanted someone to decline. By sending an invite to a rival known to be traveling or unwell, they could publicly say, "I invited him, but he didn't come." See, it's not the host's fault. He tried. The rival looks rude or aloof. Social points scored. It was reputation jujitsu. And then there's the opposite tactic, the surprise invite. A host might deliberately invite a rising star, young, popular, dangerous, to show that he's generous or in the loop. The move could stabilize alliances or backfire horribly. Imagine reclining next to the new golden boy only to find the room's attention shifted entirely to him. One moment you're holding court over honeyed lamb, the next you're muttering about aqueduct maintenance to your wine goblet. But what about the no-shows who really had no choice? Well, in rare cases, hosts forgave them, usually through a performative act of generosity, like sending leftovers wrapped in fig leaves, or having a servant publicly wish them good health the next day at the forum. That wasn't kindness, it was optics. It told the world, I am magnanimous, I can afford to be gracious. He missed my dinner. And let's not forget the uninvited who showed up anyway. It happened. Occasionally, someone would drop by. A banquet, but conveniently available, a visiting cousin, a friend from the baths, a political ally in need of a hot meal. Most hosts tolerated this, but only if the guest was charming and sat quietly. Reclining without an invite, however, that was a social sin so grave it could end careers. There's even a record of a man who reclined without permission and was quietly unreclined by slaves. Not beaten, not thrown out, just lifted, repositioned into a chair. The message was clear. You don't belong here. Honestly, it's almost more brutal than being asked to leave. So, as you lean on your cushion tonight, you now understand. Just being here, just being on the couch, means someone decided you were useful, important, or entertaining enough to deserve it. You didn't just RSVP, you passed a test. And if you're lucky, no one's watching to see if you slip a little closer to the locus medius. Because even now, at dessert, the guest list is shifting in everyone's mind. The real banquet never ends. It just moves to tomorrow's invitations. The lamps burn lower now. The air hums with wine and whispered rumors. Somewhere near the couches, someone coughs delicately into a napkin embroidered with laurel leaves. And just when you think it might be time to wind down, someone, probably a junior magistrate with something to prove, starts talking shop. Right, in Rome, even dinner could blur into politics, and not metaphorically, literally. On more than one occasion, banquets clashed directly with Senate sessions, leaving senators scrambling to juggle roast goose with tax reform. If you've ever tried to make a PowerPoint presentation while gnawing a chicken wing, you'll appreciate the absurdity. The Roman Senate wasn't exactly known for punctuality. Meetings could run long, very long, especially if someone was filibustering via Cicero cosplay. And yet, banquets were scheduled rigidly, often around religious observances or auspicious hours, so senators had a choice: miss dinner and offend the host, or arrive late to the curia and risk political backlash. Some tried to split the difference. They'd appear briefly at dinner, maybe just for a single course, then sneak out with their togas rustling like nervous pigeons. Others lingered until the last dish, only to arrive at the Senate still reeking of cinnamon quail. One fringe letter describes a senator eating stuffed sow's udder while dictating an amendment to a grain bill. Multitasking Roman style. Historians still debate how often these overlaps happened, whether they were genuine scheduling nightmares or engineered excuses to avoid the more boring sessions. What's certain is that dinner and duty collided enough that etiquette evolved around it. Hosts learned to pause conversation when messengers arrived. Guests became skilled at leaving just late enough to suggest devotion to both meal and republic. And this wasn't just a scheduling issue, it was a logistics crisis. How do you maintain posture, politics, and punctuality when your entire day is split between reclining on a couch and voting on whether Pontus gets another aqueduct? Enter the slipper carriers. Yes, certain senators employed slaves whose only job was to help them change from dinner garb to Senate regalia right there in the atrium. One fringe anecdote mentions a man who reclined through the dessert course while being retogaed by 3 servants. Imagine trying to argue grain tariffs while being wrapped like a ceremonial burrito. Even more absurd, there are accounts of senators bringing scrolls to dinner, rolled tightly, discreetly tucked into sleeves, or carried by attendants. Between bites, they might unroll a bill, mutter to themselves, and ask the guy across the couch for a legal opinion. It's as if you're nibbling pomegranate seeds while debating civil engineering contracts. But perhaps the strangest example of overlap comes from a particularly pompous senator who hosted his own banquet in the Senate chamber. This wasn't standard practice, it was scandalous, but he argued that since the senators would be stuck deliberating into the evening, they might as well eat. He ordered trays of bread, fruit, and cold cuts to be laid out mid-debate. It turned the chamber into an awkward hybrid of courtroom and picnic. Critics were furious, but others, they copied him. Soon the idea of working dinners started popping up in certain circles, proving that, even in 50 BCE, food bribery was alive and well. Let's not forget the subtle protest dinner. A political move where a senator deliberately hosted a banquet at the same time as a rival's bill debate. Invitees had to choose, support the legislation, or enjoy honey duck in good company. Their choice told everyone exactly where their loyalties lay. And sometimes dining was the session. Important laws were drafted informally over couches, with wine-softened debate greasing the gears of governance. Roman law wasn't just born in the forum. Sometimes it was born between mouthfuls of lentils and after-dinner burps. There's even speculation that key votes were swayed during dessert. If you could win someone's stomach, you might just win their signature. Still, there were limits. One law attempted to restrict banquets during Senate season, citing distraction, impropriety, and overindulgence. It failed, repeatedly. No surprise there. Nobody wanted to give up dinner just because Gaius was talking about trade reform again. So you lie there, propped on your left elbow, half listening as someone recites legislative jargon between bites. You're watching your host pretend not to panic as his quail-stuffed guests begin slipping out for the night vote. Your wine has gone warm, your feet are beginning to tingle, and your mind wanders toward aqueduct taxation for the 4th time this evening. Because in Rome, even when you're reclining in luxury, duty can barge in through the kitchen door, and sometimes you don't just eat the meal, you help rewrite the republic while digesting it. You're halfway through the banquet now. The torches sputter, the air is thick with roasted spices and ego, and your elbow is starting to go numb. A platter of something gelatinous is passed your way. You poke it, you pretend to be impressed, and somewhere across the room, someone leans in to tell a tourist that Romans built entire rooms to vomit in between courses. Let's pause here, because you've probably heard it. The legendary vomitorium, the Roman purge chamber, a marble-lined regurgitation lounge where senators would offload lunch to make room for supper. It's one of the most persistent myths in all of ancient history. But here's the truth. It never existed. That's right, no Roman ever excused himself from the triclinium to visit the vomitorium. The word vomitorium exists, yes, but it referred to the exit passages in theaters and amphitheaters, named for how they spewed forth crowds rapidly. Nothing to do with food. No golden basins, no stomach reset button. Sorry to ruin your toga party trivia. But because this is Rome, the real story is somehow weirder. See, while they didn't have formal vomitoriums, Romans were known to go to extremes at the dinner table. There are scattered accounts, mostly in satirical or moralizing texts, of elite diners quietly slipping away to induce vomiting, not as routine, but as a decadent indulgence. In those rare moments, yes, they might have emptied their bellies to make room for more delicacies, but it was never official. It was never hosted, and it certainly wasn't sanitary. Historians still argue whether these accounts are exaggerated moral fables or actual reflections of Rome's wilder households. After all, the people writing about them, like Seneca or Juvenal, loved to scold the rich. If you were trying to critique excess, claiming your rival vomits up oysters between courses is a pretty pointed metaphor. And speaking of oysters, they were everywhere, and rich Romans loved to eat them by the dozen, paired with snow-cooled wine, figs, and sometimes milk. Yes, milk, with seafood, because why stop at culinary daring when you can summon gastrointestinal warfare? But even without a dedicated purge room, Roman feasts could last hours, moving through 9 or 10 courses, with palates reset by sour wine or cold fruit. Between each course, guests were encouraged to recline more deeply, loosen their tunics, beltless fashion FTW, and mentally prepare for the next culinary ambush. And oh, the dishes! Flamingo tongue, boiled sow's womb, spiced jellyfish. Nothing was off limits. Roman chefs were obsessed with texture, novelty, and showmanship. One recipe calls for live fish to be half cooked on a heated tray so that it twitches while being served. That's not food. That's a dare. Which brings us to a darker reality. Dining was spectacle. If you weren't entertaining with conversation or gossip, you did it through food. There are records of meals that included edible gold, mechanical platters that rotated like lazy Susans from Hades, and trained slaves who recited Homer while slicing meat. And if you wanted to signal wealth and generosity, you overfed your guests intentionally, pushed them to excess, made them groan and loosen their sashes, and then sent them home with leftovers in embroidered bags. It was a flex, not just look what I can afford, but look what I can make you endure. Some fringe accounts even hint that hosts occasionally hired actors to pose as gluttons, performing exaggerated moans of pleasure and belly slaps to encourage others to join in. Think of it as the Roman version of a laugh track, but for chewing. Now, what about the cleanup? Because you can't have 10 courses without some serious crumbs. That's where the slaves under the table came in. But hold that thought, we'll get to them very soon. For now, just know that every spilled drop of garum, every fallen fig, every half-eaten eel eyeball was swiftly cleaned by a human being who had likely memorized the floor plan in total darkness. And while most of the guests wouldn't dare vomit publicly, except maybe 1 or 2 Caligula era extremists, they would absolutely overeat. The goal wasn't to feel satisfied, it was to feel displayed. You didn't just eat the food, you performed your appetite. Witty comparisons were made between pork cuts and political rivals. Someone might use a honey cake to mime a senator's bad toupee. One historian even describes a man who carved slogans into melon. That's dedication. And let's not forget the philosophers. Stoics would sit or recline stiffly at these feasts, muttering judgmental epigrams about overindulgence while politely chewing boiled turnips. Cynics, meanwhile, might mock the whole thing, until offered goose liver, of course. Then suddenly, everyone's ethical framework softened. So here you are, halfway horizontal, brain fuzzy from sweet wine, cheeks sore from too much polite nodding, when another course arrives, this one jellied. You don't ask what it is. You smile, you chew, and you pray it doesn't blink. And when someone nearby quietly excuses themselves for a breath of fresh air, you glance toward the atrium and wonder, are they stretching their legs or creating their own unofficial vomitorium? The lamps flicker, the fire's getting low, and just when you think it's safe to exhale and let the wine finally hit, you realize who's reclining next to you, your political rival. The same guy who tried to block your grain contract, undercut your tax proposal, and gave you that little oops smile when he took your usual seat in the Senate last week. Welcome to one of the strangest customs of Roman dining, reclining next to your enemies. Because in Rome, dinner wasn't just social, it was psychological warfare, and if you thought you could eat in peace, you clearly haven't read enough Cicero. Here's how it worked. Hosts, especially those with political ambitions, loved to play matchmaker with enemies. They'd seat you next to someone you just publicly insulted, someone you owed money to, someone who once accused your uncle of corruption. Why? To show unity, to force civility, and, in many cases, to gather intel. Because yes, this was Rome, and reclining close meant you had to speak softly, share dishes, even touch elbows. You were within whisper range, gossip range, confession range. More than one alliance was born or broken over a fig pastry. Historians still argue whether these seating pairings were meant as punishment, diplomacy, or just good sport. Some believe powerful hosts did it to test the social fabric. If you couldn't be civil over stuffed dormice, could you really govern a province? There's even a phrase from one surviving letter. He was placed beside him as a gesture of stitched peace. Stitched peace. As if civility could be sewn together with goose fat and conversation. But this wasn't just about peacekeeping. Reclining next to a rival was also a signal to others. If you leaned in, literally, to your enemy and shared olives without incident, it told the room, I am magnanimous, I'm mature, I'm a bigger man. But if things soured, if the conversation turned barbed or frosty, everyone noticed that too. And just imagine the body language acrobatics involved. You're lying sideways, propped on one elbow, trying to maintain your posture while your rival picks apart your last oration, with fig juice on his chin. Every eye in the room is watching. Every murmur might be quoted in tomorrow's Senate meeting. The risks were very real. There are records of feasts where rivalries erupted mid-sauce. One senator accused another of cutting the roast too aggressively, yes, cutting the roast, and used it as a metaphor for how he handled provincial tax codes. That got messy. Allegedly, wine was spilled, accidentally of course, into a silk tunic worth more than a country villa. On the fringe side of history, we have stories of deliberate provocation. Guests who came prepared with passive-aggressive toasts. One even brought a dinner gift, a miniature bust of the host's dead political opponent, and placed it next to the garum. Subtlety was not Rome's strong suit. And yet, sometimes these moments worked. Reclining forced conversation. Eating from the same platter made it hard to maintain icy silence. Some of Rome's strangest political friendships began as forced feasting proximity. There's even a record of two senators reconciling over a shared passion for a particularly spicy mustard sauce. Power, it turns out, has a surprisingly low spice tolerance. But there were limits. If tensions got too high, if voices rose, or if someone's goblet cracked under pressure, the host stepped in, not with words, but with subtle signals. A change in music, an extra course, or even a seating reshuffle disguised as a toast. Because the one thing worse than seating enemies together was failing to keep the show running. Fringe note: there's a whispered account of a host who kept a drawer of emergency compliments, little scrawls with generic praise written on them. If dinner conversation stalled or things got tense, he'd have a slave discreetly drop one beside a guest. Your toga is marvelously tailored. I heard your speech on aqueducts was thrilling. It was a desperate move, but sometimes it worked. And still the tension remained, because reclining like this, you weren't just feeding yourself, you were testing the boundaries of power. Every shared morsel was a performance. Every lean, every joke, every slightly too long glance could shift allegiances. Some even say that dinner was safer than the Senate, ironically. No knives at the table, no public record, just couches, conversation, and 100 potential alliances shifting with the passing of the honeycakes. So here you lie, elbow to elbow with the man you once debated to a standstill, both of you pretending to enjoy stuffed figs while calculating just how much the other has had to drink. Your smiles are tight, your laughs are practiced, and in a city built on control, diplomacy, and image, this strange closeness is the ultimate performance. And tomorrow, one of you might propose the other for a committee, or accuse him of treason. But tonight, you share a platter. You've survived the cold smiles, the posturing, the olive oil-soaked diplomacy. You're beginning to relax, just a little, when someone knocks over a silver dish. It vanishes beneath the table, and in the silence that follows, something moves. You blink, you lean just slightly, and there, half-shadowed and still as stone, is a slave crouched beneath the couch, already reaching for the fallen platter. Welcome to one of the most invisible, essential parts of Roman dining, the underworld of the banquet, because while senators lounged in perfumed luxury above, a small army of slaves worked quietly, efficiently, unseen, right at their feet. This isn't metaphor. At a formal Roman banquet, it was common for slaves to be stationed under the dining couches, sometimes curled beside their masters' ankles, waiting to serve. They weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to. They moved silently. Their jobs, endless. Catch falling goblets, adjust cushions, refresh perfume, monitor spills, whisper reminders, retrieve dropped morsels before they could stain a senator's robe. To recline in Rome was to be supported, literally, by bodies below. And these weren't just any slaves. Some were highly trained specialists, dining slaves, known as ministry, who understood the art of service as intimately as a poet knew meter. They knew the host's rhythms. They timed when to refill goblets, when to bring new towels, when to clear the scraps. If your elbow drooped, a small pillow would appear. If you looked confused by a dish, a murmur of explanation might brush your ear. Historians still argue how many of these silent servers were present per guest. Some sources suggest 2 to 3 per couch in wealthy homes, more during imperial feasts. And they weren't all kneeling either. Some stood by the door, others moved behind curtains. One fringe account describes slaves trained to interpret eye movements. If a guest glanced at the wine jug twice, they knew to refill. That's either genius or a horror movie. But the most unsettling part? Many guests didn't even acknowledge them. The goal of the perfect servant was invisibility. A misplaced glance, a cough, or, worst of all, a broken dish could lead to punishment. In some grimly recorded cases, public beatings took place right there at the banquet. Because nothing ruins dessert like someone dropping your favorite glass bowl. And yet, despite this brutality, slaves under the couches weren't just passive. Some were spies. Trusted by the host, they'd report who whispered what, who sneered at a dish, who complained about being seated too far from the fire. These reports were never written down. They were whispered the next morning in private chambers, shaping decisions, invitations, promotions. If you ever wondered how the host always knew who disliked the eel, this is how. One documented case involves a senator who was caught plotting against a rival at dinner because a slave overheard his murmurs and passed word to the host. That senator found himself suddenly uninvited from every major banquet for months. No explanation, just a slow social vanishing, enforced by a man who once knelt beside his feet with a bowl of rosewater. And then there's the matter of disposal. Where do you think all those bones, rinds, and crusts went? Not onto the floor, certainly not into individual trash bins. No, they were dropped into discreet bronze buckets held by slaves, some of whom moved so swiftly you barely saw them. By the time you finished a dish, its remains had already vanished. It was like feasting inside a magic trick. But perhaps the most intimate moment came with the hand-washing ritual. Between courses, slaves would bring basins, pour warm water scented with herbs over your fingers, and dry them gently with linen cloths, all while you remained reclined. The idea of getting up to clean your own hands would have seemed absurd, unthinkable. Why disturb the choreography? A fringe story tells of one particularly finicky senator who insisted that his personal slave sniff every dish before it reached him, not for poison, but for atmosphere. If the scent was wrong, the plate was replaced. Imagine being so powerful that someone else's nostrils decide your dinner. It wasn't just men benefiting from this hierarchy. When elite Roman women dined, often in separate rooms or more private gatherings, the structure below remained the same, a network of slaves, servants, and attendants making the experience seamless, soundless, and deeply unequal. And in some households, the power dynamics were even more theatrical. One source mentions a host who made his slaves eat leftovers in front of guests, not as charity, but as entertainment. Watching someone else devour your discarded peacock leg was somehow meant to emphasize your abundance. If that feels uncomfortable, good. It was. Still, there's no denying the skill involved. These under-table workers orchestrated the entire feast from the shadows, more stagehands than servants. Without them, the grandeur collapsed. The comfort, the timing, the illusion of effortlessness, it was all their doing. So, as you recline deeper into your cushion, letting the wine settle and the laughter fade into the soft clink of cutlery, spare a thought for the person beneath your couch, balancing a platter on one knee, listening to your every sigh, and preparing to vanish before your next thought forms. In Rome, dinner was a performance, and some of the finest actors never got to take a bow. By now, you've witnessed more than enough to know that Roman banquets weren't just about food. They were about optics, position, posture, and politics. And yet, you haven't even touched the most competitive part of the whole ordeal, the food itself. Because what you served and how was as political as any Senate speech, and for senators, meals were platforms, not just platters. Welcome to the edible arms race of ancient Rome, where your eel dish could make or break your reputation. Let's start with the staples. Every Roman dinner included the usual suspects: olives, lentils, fish sauce, honeyed pastries. But if you were a senator, basic was banned. You were expected to impress, and the way to do that was with exotic ingredients, absurd presentation, and excessive generosity. If a guest left hungry, you weren't just rude, you were politically negligent. So you leaned into food as theater. Imagine this: a whole boar brought out on a tray, carved to reveal live songbirds flying out from inside. That actually happened. One source describes an entire fish served encased in clear jelly that mimicked the motion of swimming. Another describes ice-packed snow from the Alps, served with fruit in summer just to prove the host had the money and connections to literally ship winter into his dining room. This wasn't gluttony, it was a performance of power. The more elaborate your menu, the stronger your message. I have reach, I have wealth, I can command the seasons. And of course, senators tried to outdo each other. Oh, you served sturgeon, mine was caught during a lunar eclipse. You had peppercorns, mine were imported by camel from the Indian coast, seasoned with Parthian salt. It wasn't just food, it was status, narrative, brand building. One historian writes about a senator who had each dish named after a conquered province: Bactrian lamb, Lusitanian greens, Egyptian honey. Whether or not the food actually came from those places didn't matter. It was a culinary map of conquest served with pride. But sometimes the whole thing backfired. Want a cautionary tale? Picture a senator who spends half his fortune importing Iberian oysters. They arrive warm, spoiled, and rubbery. Guests gag politely. One makes a joke about the Senate needing a seafood committee. Within a week, the host's name is a punchline whispered under mosaic ceilings. In Rome, a bad oyster could end a political career. This is where food politics got really strange. Some senators tried to weaponize humility. They hosted austere feasts, just boiled vegetables, basic bread, no extravagance. The message? I'm too virtuous for decadence. But this was just another flex. These dinners were performatively plain, and yes, guests still reclined on silk cushions while sipping the humble broth. Others leaned into the absurd. One fringe account tells of a man who served only animal tongues, calf, goat, bird, claiming it was a feast for those who speak wisely. Another banned bread entirely and offered guests edible silver leaf cakes, which looked amazing but tasted like metallic sadness. Then came competition between hosts. If one senator hosted a banquet with 7 courses, the next might try 9. One upped the ante with mid-source musical performances, another included live animals as table decor, until one stole a honey cake and chaos ensued. Even the utensils became part of the show. You might find yourself eating off a triple-handled dish with a spoon shaped like a dolphin. Forks weren't in common use yet, so fingers were fair game, but dainty ones, washed every few minutes with rose water by slaves bearing tiny basins, every motion choreographed. And then there was the wine. Oh, the wine. Serving Greek vintages? Predictable. Serving wine that had been aged in resin-lined amphorae buried beneath the host's villa for 2 decades? Now that told a story. Some even scented their wines with violet, myrrh, or absinthe-like herbs to open the stomach. Whether or not this opened the stomach was another matter. One senator, according to rumor, served a wine so strong that it made a guest hallucinate a flying toga. He never lived it down. The toga or the wine. And while guests dined, they judged. Every bite was a signal. Every flavor was a message. Eat too eagerly and you looked greedy. Pick at your food, aloof. Praise too much, flatterer. Complain about seasoning, suicidal. So you had to eat with tactical enthusiasm, enough to show appreciation, not enough to look desperate. You might even prepare a compliment in advance. The cinnamon notes remind me of my time in Bithynia. Whether you'd actually been to Bithynia was irrelevant. It was about sounding cultured. But the most ambitious move of all? Serving a dish no one recognized. Something rare, regional, and borderline mysterious. That's where the eel came in. Eel, particularly Murani, the fat, spotted variety prized in Roman fish ponds, was the ultimate flex. Tasty, dramatic, and difficult to raise. One senator famously gave each of his prized eels names, and guests could request them by name before devouring them. Yes, it was creepy. Yes, it became fashionable. The real power, though, was in turning food into a talking point. By the time dessert arrived, a pyramid of nuts and honey so perfectly geometric it made Euclid weep, you weren't just full. You were impressed, intimidated, and hopefully just insecure enough to remember exactly who fed you. Because in Rome, as in politics, you are what you serve, and if you serve it with enough flair, you might just serve yourself into history. You've endured the eel, clinked goblets with your nemesis, and nodded solemnly through 3 dessert courses disguised as moral allegories. You think you've seen everything until the door creaks open and he walks in. The emperor? Not every dinner included a divine guest, of course, but when the emperor did decide to drop by, the rules of the entire universe changed, because hosting Caesar, or even a cousin of Caesar, was the most terrifying, thrilling, and expensive nightmare a Roman senator could hope for. There's no polite way to say it. If the emperor comes to dinner, you're doomed. Doomed to succeed, or doomed to rebuild your house and reputation from the ruins of too much effort. Because once he's reclined in your triclinium, you are no longer a host. You are a supplicant. Let's set the scene. You get the imperial word. Augustus will be dining with you this evening, or Caligula, or Hadrian. Pick your poison. Immediately, your house goes into panic. Slaves are dispatched in every direction. Floors are scrubbed with imported oils. New dishes are commissioned. Musicians are summoned. And a small shrine to Fortuna is discreetly polished for extra luck. The couch layout? Abandoned. You don't assign Caesar a seat. He takes whichever one he wants. And then you rebuild the seating arrangement around him. If he chooses your usual spot, tough luck. If he wants to recline alone, clear a couch. If he decides he'd rather stand, you stand. Your knees are no longer your own. Historians still argue whether these imperial dinners were common or rare. Some claim emperors used banquets to reward loyalty. Others say they were tests of devotion or even traps, because if your feast disappointed him, you might wake up tomorrow without your Senate seat, or your house, or, your head. Let's look at a fringe example. Emperor Claudius, who was known for his surprisingly voracious appetite, once attended a feast where the host failed to prepare enough honeyed snails. Claudius jokingly accused the man of hating mollusks and monarchy. A joke. Everyone laughed. The next day, the host's name quietly disappeared from an important civic project. Coincidence? Sure, let's say that. So, what do you serve an emperor? Everything. Twice. You start with bread still steaming from the fire, shaped into imperial symbols. You bring in wine cooled with imported snow. You commission food sculptures, maybe a bust of Mars made of roasted game. You name dishes after his victories, even if the victory of Noricum was just a supply caravan arriving on time. There's one report of a host creating an entire meal themed around Jupiter, with thunderbolt-shaped skewers and cloud-like cheeses. The emperor, delighted, the guests, terrified. But food isn't enough. Now you need entertainment. Acrobats, dancers, musicians. One senator famously hired a troupe of mimes to reenact Senate debates, complete with absurd wigs and fake scrolls. Another had a group of trained parrots recite flattering quotes about the emperor. It went over well until one bird coughed mid-sentence and was promptly removed. No risks. Then there's the matter of gifts. You can't let Caesar leave empty-handed, so you present him with a ceremonial cup, or a small statue, or even a slave renowned for his singing voice. Of course, it's understood that you'll never get these things back. You don't give them, you offer them, like tribute. Want a weird one? Emperor Commodus was said to enjoy feasts where guests had to dress as gods, including himself. A senator once showed up as Neptune, complete with a trident and seaweed-trimmed tunic. He was mocked mercilessly for weeks, but only after the emperor left. At the time, everyone nodded solemnly, pretending the man didn't smell like a sardine market. If things went well, the emperor might reward you, a favorable mention in public, a nod in the forum, maybe even a plum administrative post. But if things went poorly, the fallout was silent and chilling. There's an apocryphal tale of an emperor who left a banquet halfway through dessert. No explanation. The next morning, the host's house was seized for public beautification. The message was clear. Never let your custard curdle in front of the divine. But the worst-case scenario? The emperor outstays his welcome. Some stayed for days. Others returned the next evening. If Caesar liked your villa, he might treat it as his own. If he liked your wife's singing voice, best hope he's just being appreciative. The presence of imperial power at dinner was as intoxicating as the wine, and just as likely to ruin your life if handled improperly. And the guests? Oh, they suffered too. No one could speak freely. Every joke was calculated. Every toast had to include some subtle praise of the emperor's recent infrastructure project. There's a record of one man who toasted to the smoothness of the Appian Way, causing an awkward silence that still echoes through history. So here you are, watching Caesar's lift a morsel of goose to his lips. He chews slowly, he swallows, and then he smiles. Your heart, previously doing laps in your ribcage, slows to a gallop. The slaves exhale, the guests unclench, and you recline back just slightly, pretending it was all planned. Because for tonight, you've survived the storm. The emperor ate. The emperor smiled. Now you just have to hope he leaves. The emperor is gone. The couches are sticky with wine and ash. The entertainers have vanished into the atrium. And now, finally, there's silence. You stretch, adjust your pillow, and try not to look too smug. But don't get too comfortable, because you're still reclining, and everyone is watching you. Why? Because posture in Rome was political. Always. You might think it's enough to be reclining in the triclinium, nibbling candied dates and trading toasts, but how you recline matters, And that means the room is judging your spine like it's delivering a Senate vote. Too upright? You look tense, rigid, like you're not used to luxury. The implication? Maybe you're newly rich. Maybe you're insecure. Maybe you think reclining is for other people, not real patriots. Too relaxed? You're decadent, lazy, overindulged. Are you even a Roman at this point, or just a couch lizard covered in goose fat? Reclining too deep could signal that you've lost touch with virtue, and Rome hates when its senators look too comfortable. Historians still argue whether these postural judgments were codified or just intense social pressure, but the results were the same. There was a correct recline, and you'd better master it. That angle? Somewhere between a soft lean and a measured sprawl. Your elbow anchored, your torso gracefully tilted, not slumped. Eyes engaged, hand poised, always ready to grab a grape or make a clever remark. Think, I'm relaxed, but alert. Luxurious, but still morally superior. One surviving satire even describes the 7 sins of posture: slouching, sprawling, propping with both arms, lying flat, reclining backward, fidgeting too much, and worst of all, eating while fully horizontal. That was considered vulgar, almost animalistic. There's a comic scene in a Roman play where a drunk guest keeps tipping sideways while reaching for garum, and the host actually has him escorted out, not for drunkenness, but for dishonoring the posture. Some hosts had personal preferences, too. One fringe account tells of a man who banned any guest who reclined with crossed ankles. He believed it attracted invidia, the evil eye. Another refused to host left-hand recliners, saying it disrupted the natural spiral of dinner conversation. We may never know what that means. It wasn't just about physical comfort. Posture reflected political allegiance. Stoics, for example, often reclined more stiffly, avoiding indulgent poses as a mark of restraint. Epicureans, far more relaxed. You could guess someone's philosophy just by watching how they handled a second course of oysters. And this was dangerous. If you reclined like a philosopher, you might be seen as critical of imperial excess. If you reclined like a poet, you were dramatic, like a general, cold and formal. No matter how you positioned your elbow, someone was interpreting it. Want to make it worse? Enter the scroll recliners. These were the men who brought scrolls, legal drafts, poems, letters, and read them during the meal, reclining with exaggerated care. Oh no, I couldn't possibly join in the laughter. I'm reviewing legislation. It was meant to impress. Usually it just annoyed everyone. Then there were the recline critics, men who made it their entire dinner activity to comment on how others reclined. You slouch, they smirk. You readjust, they raise an eyebrow. One guest became infamous for bringing his own measuring stick, using it to demonstrate correct shoulder elevation to confused newcomers. He never got invited back. But the pressure didn't only come from above the couches. Servants below often adjusted their masters' positions throughout the night. A slave might tug at a sleeve, reposition a bolster, or discreetly shift your elbow back into social alignment. There's something unnerving about being puppeteered into virtue by someone you're meant to ignore. But that's Roman dining for you. And if you think posture anxiety only hit the newcomers, think again. Even veterans stressed. One senator, well into his 70s, was caught practicing his recline alone the day before a major banquet. His wife found him lying on a couch, muttering to himself, adjusting his left shoulder by degrees. "The consul's watching," he whispered. "He always watches." Why such obsession? Because posture wasn't just visual, it was symbolic. It told the room, I belong here, I understand the rhythm of power. I can relax in a world of rules because I know exactly which ones not to break. And if you nailed it, if you reclined with just the right mix of charm and control, people noticed. A perfect recline could get you invited back. A perfect recline could land you a magistrate's endorsement. One poet claimed that a well-executed elbow lean once got a man promoted to provincial governor. We don't know if that's true, but it feels Roman. So here you lie, carefully arranged, the cushion just right beneath your ribs, the folds of your toga cascading in a way that suggests wealth but not vanity. You're full but not bloated, relaxed but not reclining into sin. You pick up a single fig with 2 fingers, chew slowly, and offer a wry smile. And just like that, you've passed the test. Tonight you are not just reclining. You are reclining with intent. The feast has stretched into night. Lamps flicker low. One man snoring softly beneath a wreath of bay leaves, while another murmurs a poem about Saturn in an over-salted accent. The servants have stopped refilling goblets quite so quickly. You'd think this was the end, the winding down of another decadent Roman evening. But then someone walks in wearing black. Because even in Rome, where every meal is theater and every posture politics, there was one kind of dinner that flipped the rules completely. The morning banquet. Yes, that's a real thing. When a senator suffered a political defeat, lost an election, had a bill rejected, got publicly shamed in court, or was passed over for promotion, it was customary in some circles to host a sad dinner, a kind of edible elegy for lost status. And yes, guests would attend, because Romans loved nothing more than watching someone else's dignity try to survive a roasted turnip. You recline carefully. The couches are still there, but the tone is different. Drapes are drawn, torches burn dimmer. Some guests wear gray or black tunics, a symbolic nod to your misfortune. One brings a bottle of particularly bitter wine, meant to match the mood. Another toasts 2 better victories next year before even sitting down. Ow. Historians still debate whether these events were acts of defiance, irony, or genuine self-humiliation. The truth? Probably all 3. In a society obsessed with image, acknowledging failure publicly and with flair was one way to stay in control of the narrative. You could suffer in private, or you could suffer with a charcuterie board and some semblance of dignity. These gatherings weren't just for pity. They were calculated moves. By hosting even in defeat, you signaled resilience, generosity. Look, I may have lost the tribune's favor, but I still have salted lamb and 12 men willing to recline beside me. There's power in that. And they weren't all somber. In fact, some got weirdly funny. A fringe report tells of one man who served only black-colored foods, burnt bread, squid ink sauces, over roasted meats, then ended the night by tossing his senatorial sash into the fire while shouting, "Tell the Republic she can keep her census reforms." He was back in office 6 months later. Coincidence? Maybe, but never underestimate the political currency of a well-timed meltdown. Others used the occasion to send messages. Dishes shaped like broken scrolls, desserts molded into miniature temples, toppled or cracked. One host passed around empty goblets with the inscription, "For the laws I could not pass." Too much? Perhaps. But unforgettable? Absolutely. Even the seating arrangements changed. The host might place himself at the farthest end of the lowest couch, symbolically demoting himself, and seat his allies in the center, signaling, "I may have fallen, but I still uplift others." That's some emotional posture craft right there. But there was risk too. If the event came off too desperate or too bitter, it could solidify your reputation as finished. One senator, according to the poet Martial, reclined in mourning 3 times in a year and was never taken seriously again. You only get so many sad dinners before the Republic starts whispering about your appetite for tragedy. Still, some of these banquets became legendary, stories of how gracefully someone bore their fall, how cleverly they turned loss into art. In one instance, a failed consul candidate commissioned a bard to sing songs only about his past achievements, while serving leftover dishes from previous feasts. It was both nostalgic and painfully symbolic. Guests called it the Dinner of Echoes. No one forgot it. Even the food carried weight. Simple dishes, often rural in theme, pulses, barley, herbs from one's ancestral estate, were served to remind guests and rivals that the host was grounded, rustic, still virtuous. "I've been humbled," the meal said, "but I remain Roman." It's hard to mock a man offering you hand-ground chickpeas and stoic eye contact. But not every morning banquet was about political loss. Some commemorated the death of a family member, or even a particularly beloved slave or animal. One senator famously hosted a vigil-style dinner after the death of his prize eel. Yes, the eel from earlier, and invited poets to recite elegies. The dish of the night? Eel, guests were confused. Whether tragic, theatrical, or quietly stoic, these dinners gave structure to loss. Rome had no therapy, no Instagram to post sad selfies on. What it had was wine, posture, and the ability to turn grief into ritual. And they served another purpose too. They reminded everyone present, this could be you. Because in a world built on favors, reputation, and social precision, one wrong vote or misstep could land you at your own dinner of defeat. And when it did, best have your fig-wrapped metaphors and ironic poetry ready. So you lie there now, perhaps a guest at someone else's morning banquet, reclining just carefully enough to suggest sympathy without alignment. You sip the bitter wine. You nod at the subtle symbolism of the black olives. And in the flicker of a dying oil lamp, you whisper to yourself the most Roman survival mantra of all: don't lose. But if you do, make it interesting. The banquet is nearly over. The last crumbs of honeyed pastries cling to silver trays. The room smells of citrus peel, warm wax, and faint regret. Guests murmur their goodbyes in tones pitched just above exhaustion. And you recline still, watching the candlelight dance over empty goblets and crumpled napkins, bearing witness to the slow collapse of a ritual that once ruled the Republic. Because here's the truth you've been sensing all evening. The Roman dining tradition was dying, even as it thrived in marble villas and echoed with poetry. It wasn't sudden. The couches didn't catch fire. The servants didn't walk out en masse. But the decline was there, in the shift from meaning to spectacle, from hierarchy to farce, where once reclining meant freedom, citizenship, mastery of self. Now it was becoming just another thing rich men did to impress each other. Historians trace the cracks to the late Republic. As Rome expanded, it devoured new provinces, new luxuries, and new excuses for decadence. The old rules, those rigid reclining codes of posture and power, began to fray. More guests were invited, more couches crammed in. Hosts stopped caring whether you reclined left or right, so long as your purse was heavy and your stories good. One satirical letter from the time describes a dinner where 20 men reclined in a single circle, laughing at their own flatulence and calling it philosophical air. The host, a newly rich olive merchant with no formal education and a fondness for singing his guest list aloud. The writer laments, "Rome does not dine, she gurgles." And the food? It got even stranger. Gone were the thoughtful combinations, the regional pride. Instead, pure shock value took over. Jellyfish tongues, flaming dishes lit with powdered sulfur. One host commissioned an entire meal of artificially colored courses. Green eggs, blue grapes, black milk, just to provoke conversation. It worked. Unfortunately, so did the indigestion. Posture lost its meaning too. By the early empire, men reclined however they liked, sprawled sideways, laid fully on their backs. Some even sat upright by choice. A gesture once unthinkably humble, now repurposed as ironic rebellion. A new generation of diners wanted to be seen as effortless. Try-harding your recline? That was for the old guard. Meanwhile, invitations became currency, bribes disguised as banquets, dinners purchased, staged, auctioned. One senator reportedly offered a consulship candidate 5 dinners and a dowry, hoping the social exposure would secure his own promotion. The candidate declined. The senator hosted anyway, with a cardboard consul seated at the center couch. Subtle. And of course, the emperor factor ruined everything. Once emperors began hosting their own banquets, larger, louder, more ridiculous, the elite scrambled to impress faded. Why host a clever dinner when Caesar's palace had gladiators serving garum? Why plan a witty seating arrangement when Nero just recreated the Battle of Actium with puppets on pudding? The old triclinium became theater, a place of parody, not power. Even the couches changed. Once rigid symbols of wealth, they morphed into plush velvet absurdities. Some were carved into animal shapes. One fringe account mentions a dining couch shaped like a swan, with the guest reclining in its open wings. Another, shaped like a lion, roared when someone leaned back too far, mechanically. Of course. But perhaps the biggest sign of decline? The guest list itself. Where once only citizens could recline, later years saw freedmen, merchants, actors, even foreigners joining the feast. For traditionalists, it was unthinkable. For everyone else, it was inevitable. Rome had grown too large, too chaotic, too layered with contradictions to maintain a dining rule book. So by the time of the late empire, reclining became a nostalgic act, a callback to a time when position mattered, when elbows spoke louder than words. A few senators clung to the rituals like aging actors performing the same role long after the audience stopped clapping. But most, they stopped pretending. They dined, they feasted, they laughed, sometimes through belches, sometimes through tears. And the couches stayed, but the meaning seeped out of the cushions like spilled wine. So here you recline, on the edge of centuries, the last sips of a vanished world resting on your tongue. Around you, ghosts of posture, honor, and eel jellies drift in the fading torchlight. And somewhere inside, you know, this wasn't just dinner. It was a world's strange, decadent attempt to arrange itself by elbows, to define power through posture, to turn food into philosophy. And now, as the cushions deflate and the scrolls of etiquette gather dust, you close your eyes. Because Rome no longer reclines, she thinks. The oil lamps grow still. The echoes of laughter and clinking goblets dissolve into the hush of night. The couches, once alive with scheming and satire, now hold only sleeping limbs and the soft creak of overused cushions. You let your elbow rest, fully this time, no angles to manage, no rival's breath on your shoulder, just the weight of your body, finally unjudged. The linen beneath you is warm. The air smells of old wine and pine ash. Somewhere in the distance, a flute begins its final, fluttering notes. You've traveled through a feast that was never truly about food, a ritual stitched with posture, pride, and quiet rivalries. You've seen how Romans built entire hierarchies, from the tilt of a shoulder, how silence was filled with watching eyes, and how even a fig could carry meaning. But now, all that complexity folds away. The guests slip into sleep. The servants snuff out the final flames. No one's watching anymore, and the ancient city, so full of noise, movement, and maneuvering, settles into silence. Breathe deep. Let the cushions cradle your spine. There's nothing more to perform. No more courses, no more gestures, no more senators hiding behind posture. Only sleep. Soft, certain, and unobserved.